Todd Spangler from Variety, and Variety.com is the biggest entertainment news site on the internet, and it runs on WordPress, so thank you. Automattic, we'll bring up the Reservoir panel here. First, we have Anil Dash, technologist. This says prominent technologist. He was name dropped in the movie, so yes. He's a writer and ethical tech advocate. He's also on the board of the Electronic Frontier Foundation for the past 6 or so years. Next, we have Eric Binnion, who is an automatician. He works for Automattic, and he's a longtime WordPress contributor. Eric, thanks for taking a seat here. Next up is Bao Nguyen, who directed this film. He's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, and he's going to take a seat right here. He's from LA, so he got in today. Thanks for coming out today, Bao. And then last but not least, we have Paolo Belcastro. He's also an automatician. He's the artistic director for the Domains Maisons, and he can explain what that means now or later. But he's trilingual, and we're glad to have these folks up here to talk about this film. Bao, I want to start with you. If you could just tell us, first of all, what drew you to this project? And then if you could talk a little bit about how you told the story with the tones that we saw. You know, it kind of alternated, as I read it, between kind of this repertorial, just the facts, here's what it is. Then it went into some, you know, it alternates between this inspirational message and then kind of a warning in there as well, and then ends on, I mean, it's a recruitment video, right? You want to join this movement. How did you think about it, and why did you want to do this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, well, I want to thank the team who helped make this happen. We couldn't have made it without you all. There's a lot of people to name, so I won't list everyone off. But yeah, I think one of the great privileges of being a filmmaker, especially a documentary filmmaker, is kind of being thrown into a world where you don't belong. And for me, I'm not a technologist. I'm a storyteller. And so to be thrown into the world of open source and amongst the world of many of the people standing on the stage was a great privilege. And I learned a lot. I didn't know a lot. And so I was hoping that this film could both be sort of this emotional human story of why we are connected to tech, what are our first like curiosities to tech and computers and the internet, and also this bigger philosophy of open source and sort of deconstructing that for a layperson who might not know how much open source surrounds us in everything we do. I think for me, a lot of films about tech can be very dystopian, and I wanted to make a film that was more protopian, that gave sort of practical ideas of how we can move forward and learn from, you know, what values we have as human beings and bring that into how we practice our use of technology.
Right. I mean, there are action items here explicitly really in the film. Paolo, you know, one of the messages is be a landowner, not a tenant. You know, we're talking about this a little bit. I used to have my own website, toddspangler.com. Nobody take that domain name because it's currently available and I'm going to relaunch it. But you know, there's this idea that, you know, you guys are a for-profit company, but you want to, you know, rally this idea behind you are in control of your digital persona and your digital destiny.
Yes. So, for instance, we actually offer a free service to the vast majority of our users, and they can have a website, and then we will give them for free what is called a subdomain. We'll give them an address, but it's on our address. And so, about being a landowner, the idea is that even with the best motivation in the world, we are definitely a company that believes in your freedom. We might be tomorrow in a position not to be able to give you your address. And so if you own your own domain name, your own address, suddenly that doesn't matter for you. We could disappear. You can still be there. You can still be accessible. And I think this is something that is really important. All those communities, we have seen that in the movie, all those communities that have disappeared and all the ones that exist today could disappear tomorrow. It's essentially because people accepted this tenancy contract or say, oh yeah, I'm here and I'm borrowing basically your address. And so that is the first easy step going forward. Maybe you don't need a website. Maybe you think, oh, why would I need a website? It's complicated. And I'm not even going to try to convince you it's not, but you probably have an email address. That is also something that you're fundamentally, essentially borrowing from someone else. And so having your own domain, again, is a way to say, this is my little piece of this internet land. I own it and nobody can take it away from me.
Anil, this question for you, this idea of we're going to give you free things to use and play with and everything. That's sort of counterintuitive for a capitalist mindset, right? What was your impression of the movie? And, we can talk more about what do you say?
Impression of the movie, there's sort of a lot of deep things there. I said about earlier, there's so much there that's technical, but Matt Mullenweg, who's featured in the story, is a friend, and I met Matt for the first time when he was 19 years old, and his first trip to San Francisco, I picked him up at the airport, and I was like, this is where the tech is, and sort of took him around, and and was texting with him earlier this week. We were talking about our mutual friend who passed, and I think it goes to the in the code for the people, the people part. So much of this starts from the technology, and after, that was 20 plus years ago, 22 years ago that, that I picked Matt up at the airport, and it's so easy to get into bits and bytes, and this is why this matters, and what are we doing in terms of the business model. And the reason Matt and I knew each other is I was building a competitive product, right? Like this was, we were the enemies, right? This is Coke and Pepsi or whatever you want to say, and would, snipe at each other on the internet. No, my job was to say WordPress was worse, right? You know what I mean? And now it's like all that fades, and what, perseveres is that we both are connected by giving a damn about what was open, right? And I think that's sort of the tribute. That company I worked for is gone because it wasn't open.
Yeah.
But everything I wrote, I still have because I always did it on something that was open.
Yeah.
Right. And every friend I care about, I met through my personal website, like the people who introduced me to my wife. Right. And so it's really hard to giving a shit about open source, open web. It's like being I care about sexy electricity, right? This is this utility, right? Or I care about fun water, right? That's a utility. You shouldn't care about that.
Or you care about representative democracy, right? I don't think
we take it for granted, right?
We're on the 250-year cusp of the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and
it's
now,
easy
right?
to take for granted.
Topography is got that Constitution Gothic thing going on. It's a manifesto, right? Eric, let me ask you. We heard in the film that most every large company does use open source software, but not every company has the same philosophy as your company. When you think about using this algorithmically self-contained business model versus that we've seen a lot of the big AI companies going after too, right? What makes it different for Automattic, and how do people, trust that that's something they want to be a part of?
So the question is, how does Automattic deal with open source software, just to be clear?
Yeah.
Give or take. I think the way we look at it at Automattic is we have these same internal arguments, right? I led the payments engineering teams over the last year or so, and that's something we wanted a greater share of. And so we've literally had these arguments, how do we maybe close it down versus not? And then we come out and we're like, no, like we're going to fight actually for this open source thing, right? And we don't close down anything. And so I think like as a leader of open source, like we're not immune to like the commercial aspects, of course,
Right.
we obviously use lots of open source throughout, right? Like we've moved off of proprietary tools to like move into open source tools. Actually, I think LibreChat is an example, is one of the ones that we like most internally. And it gives us a lot of flexibility and freedom as well, right? So we can tie into our own models, we can use local models, all these things. I think this. Yeah.
Yeah, but the idea is bigger than one company. Correct. Right. Paolo, how does that the open source community, why is that good business to have this, it's not a communist idea, but you give back to the community, right? Why is that a good business decision?
It's because we use this software, the same WordPress that you can download and have on your computer. We use the same exact WordPress, right? And so what happens there is that something Anil was saying is people don't really care about those abstract concepts. Like you cannot convince people to use open source software because it's give them freedom or because it gives them ownership. You can tell them, but at the end of the day, people are looking for convenience. People are looking for a great user experience. And so investing in the product is what allows us to provide a better user experience to those users. Now, it is true that when we do invest back into the product, we also give to every one of our competitors. But the idea of open source is that we all do that. And so it's like, it's the tide that rises, all boats. So that's the idea, is we all contribute to it and we all together rise to give a user experience that is compelling enough that people then end up also benefiting from the freedom and the ownership that we promote.
I mean, why do some people not buy into that?
I mean, I think they're scared. I think one of the things that everybody who works for Automattic is too nice to say, but I think this is one of those things that is really important is you can suck the money out of the room for the bad guys, right? Like if you make a thing free and you make it possible for people to have it for free, like a lot of people who pay for WordPress or pay for other open source things, they're paying for it because they want to, because they like the people who make it. Mm-hmm. Right. And they will I see this all the time when I worked on other open source projects. People are like, I would rather pay you the full price for your open source product than pay those like scumbags who make the commercial product because they are going to extort me, or I feel like I'm trapped by them.
Yeah.
And I feel good about it. And so I think that's part of it, is like just shifting the balance of power to the people that they feel that they trust. And so and there are still a lot of companies that are like, oh, we don't know if we feel safe with open source or like for this job or whatever. But for the most part, the people who are really, really technical understand the virtues of it and the values of it. But I think the other part is like I said, people who are not super, super technical don't necessarily care about that, but they see the risks. They see the things that everybody goes through. Like I think tons and tons of like regular people are talking about enshittification these days. Yeah. And they don't Enshittification.
It was bleeped out in the movie.
Yeah, and Cory Doctorow wrote a great book about it, and he's been he coined the word and has sort of been a great evangelist for this concept about the ways things are sort of rapidly decay and once users are captured into a platform, and really one of the reasons it's possible is because people don't have alternatives. Yeah. And in open source, you always have an alternative.
I mean, and this really is important to people because the internet is so central to our lives. And you can't live a modern life without interacting and having some sort of digital presence. So it is, it's variety. We're here. It's a mainstream issue. It's not just something that is an obscure. By the way, it showed the news groups from the early days of the internet. I remember going on news groups way back when, from our dial-up.
These are like Discord chat rooms before the web existed.
Yes, exactly. From my dial-up in Brooklyn way back when. But Bao, I wanted to ask you, so one of the first cuts, one of the rough cuts of the film was longer, right? It was not 20 minutes. What drove you to think that this was the right way to tell the story?
Great question. I think it's a very dense film, even for 20 minutes. So even I think expanding it, we had a cut that was like 3 hours, which is way too long. I mean, so to bring it down to 20 minutes and, shout out to our editors, Sue and Sarah, for bringing it down. But I think at the end of the day, it was trying to make something that is digestible for people who are having to talk about these really dense matters. And so it is also, you mentioned in the first question you asked me, is just like interweaving that human sort of the intimate with almost the infrastructural.
When Matt talks about his dad, I mean, that's a very touching moment.
Yeah. And I think that's the way how, for me, it's like that curiosity of tech and reminding ourselves that behind, code, that open source code is there are people, it's a community behind it. And when you kind of lose a sense of like the human beings behind it, that's when, it can get a bit dystopian.
So one of the messages, again, from the movie is this moving from belief to participation, not just taking for granted that this is how things will be forever and ever, but you got to work at it, right? You got to water your garden. Let me ask each of you, we'll just go down the line. What's the takeaway for the audience members here tonight, or people who see the film, whoever they are? What's the most impact-driven first step they can take to take control and be part of this thing?
I think maybe a first step is look at the tools you use every day and who they belong to, and if they are proprietary closed, if you can see inside, is there an alternative that is actually open and that you could actually see inside?
Yeah, Bao, what's the one takeaway, let's say?
I mean, for me, like just narratively, when you think about how you interact with the world, are you a reservoir or are you a swamp, right? Like, and using that idea and approaching things that way, like that's how I got to understand like what open source was relating to how I try to approach the world.
Yeah, keep it fresh. Eric, what's your message, parting takeaway?
I'll go slightly more action oriented. I would challenge all of you, if you don't already have a domain, to go buy a domain and start like a link in bio. You can do it on WordPress.com in probably 5 minutes. And like that's now your space on the open web.
By the way, johnsmith.com is available, but we looked it up, and whoever is sitting on it is asking $1.57 million. Anil, what is your one takeaway here?
I love all of those. The one I'd push on is language. Like we fall back on convenience. A lot of you will have heard somebody say, look at my Substack. There's no such thing as my Substack. Right? You don't own it. You can have an email newsletter, but there is no such thing as my Substack. You will see people say unalive because the algorithm is telling them they can't use the word dead. There's no such thing as unalive, right? Like challenge yourself to change your language to conform to what you think and to what you actually believe and what you actually own, and not be controlled by companies that will actually shape your thoughts, right? Because they will hold you hostage to their closed systems. Like if you can start to control your language and control the language of those around you, push people when they say like, subscribe to my Substack, remind them there is no such thing. If you can do that, then you can get to having your
just plain devil's advocate, Anil. Shouldn't governments be able to thwart anti-competitive behavior?
That is the right answer, but we are not in a place where we have the rule of law in those areas in this country.
And maybe especially when it comes to AI, let me ask, at this point, I think the movie kind of is a little questioning what the future is at this moment of big AI companies. Paolo, what are your thoughts on what does this mean? Future of open source in the age of AI. These companies, as it points out in the movie, they've grown based on the backs of things like Wikipedia, which are open source, free information resources.
I mean, there's an irony there, which is that large AI companies complain about what they call model distillation, basically competitors trying to extract all the knowledge from their models for free. while those
you did the same
models
thing.
were trained on all these freely available content
Yeah.
without asking questions, without asking for permission, and basically reselling them the product. So this is one of those things, I think, at the core of the open source license Matt mentions, the GPL, is the fact that the license is viral, which means that if you take some software that is under that license, the GPL, and modify it and distribute it, you have to carry the license with it. So you have to allow other people to modify it.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems logical, right? That you benefited for something, you give the same something back. Well, those AI companies have completely broken that model. They have taken everything that was available for free, regardless of what kind of license it had, and then they wrap it up in a box that is closed and sell it to you. And, going back to what Anil was saying, they can tomorrow decide that, we're not going to use that type of sentence. We're not going to say that type of thing. The answers will never go in that direction. Now, of course, some of those things are for safety, like there are very good reasons, but we also know that the safety in an open source environment, everybody can have an eye on it and check that, hey, yes, you're applying safety boundaries, but you're not overstepping. In a closed box, nobody can figure out what's going on inside.
So what's the antidote? Anybody else want to weigh in on?
I mean, one of the challenges is people will say about open source with AI, the open source AI tools aren't as good as the big commercial tools.
Okay.
And the question is what we consider good, right? Because what you just described is the big AI tools do not practice consent about what they do to the web and what they do to creators and what they do to the rest of the world. And there are still parts of culture that think consent matters, right? Whether the people that run those companies care, the rest of us do care. And so those are things we can say. It's like good is defined as caring about consent. And so AI models that are open source inherently practice consent because that is a value that open source.
And those do exist.
And they do exist. And so we can say, this is what we consider good. And these open source AI models are good for our values. And that's one of the things that's actually great is there are lots of them. And especially in the global South, especially in Scandinavia, weirdly, they love open source AI there and they're developing lots of them, love them for it. And so there's lots of places around the world that are developing these things. The rest of the world is not happy about using American technology for all the obvious reasons. And so they're developing alternatives that are open. Great news is we can still use them because they're open source. And so I think a lot of these tools are going to develop. And one of the things that's really, really important is thinking about there being one option in a technology category is so broken-brained. It's like thinking there should be one restaurant, right? Like you shouldn't have like just McDonald's. There should be lots of little mom and pop restaurants in all different kinds of cuisines, right? And the same is true in technology. Lots and lots of options. Like, these tools we're talking about let you make lots and lots of different websites. They don't all look the same. And so that idea, like there should be lots and lots of little AIs for all different topics. Because what you get when you have one big platform is ChatGPT is telling people's children to self-harm, right?
Allegedly.
No, it's true. This is a fact, right? There are still facts. And when we have there's this great VFX house in LA, Corridor Digital, and they made an AI tool that helps you take the green screen images off of a green screen and extracts them really well. It's for a specific purpose. It works really well. They trained it on their own content with consent. It will never tell people's kids to self-harm because it has a purpose and it's made by creators for creators and it's open source.
Well, Bao, you'll get the last question here. We are out of time, but I wanted to ask you, what was the one most interesting thing you learned from doing this project, meeting the folks at Automattic and doing all the research you did?
Well, I think, as Eric was saying, like the idea of as culture and content lives on the internet, right? But as someone who makes films, I don't always think about that I'm renting the space from someone.
Right.
And so the idea of being an owner versus a tenant was something that really connected to me as someone who's thinking about where do my films live? and what agency I have over that. So I think for filmmakers who don't feel like they're connected to open source, like it is valuable to think about that philosophy. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, like open source and that philosophy and public domain and the internet have, for me as like this kid who grew up in the internet watching like behind the scenes of like Spielberg films, or like, the access I have to content and films and like film history is beautiful. So there is this like thing about technology that we can embrace, but as Anil said, like having those values, like what makes us human, and being able to remind ourselves about that as we move forward is important.
And be vigilant about protecting it and defending it. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for making this movie. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight.